Jennifer Chen stood on the sidewalk in front of the luxury apartment building with her suitcases at her feet, her hands trembling with shock and hurt as she watched her mother-in-law, Margaret Patterson, close the door with finality. And the most painful part wasn't the eviction itself but the words Margaret had shouted before slamming that door. "You've been living off my son's hard work for 3 years, taking advantage of his kindness, never contributing anything to this household. And I'm done enabling your laziness. Get out and learn to stand on your own 2 feet, for once in your privileged life." What Margaret didn't know, what Jennifer had kept secret for exactly those 3 years, was that every single month, without fail, Jennifer had been anonymously paying the entire $4,800 rent on the 3-bedroom apartment where Margaret lived, where Jennifer and her husband David had moved in to help care for Margaret after her husband died. And Jennifer had done it secretly, quietly, through a property management company, because Margaret's pride was fierce and her independence was everything to her. And Jennifer had known that if Margaret discovered her daughter-in-law was paying her rent, she would feel humiliated, diminished, like charity was being forced upon her. So Jennifer had found a way to help without stripping away Margaret's dignity, had let Margaret believe the apartment was part of some survivor benefit from her late husband's pension, had sacrificed vacations and new cars and her own apartment fund to ensure her grieving mother-in-law had a safe, beautiful home. And now she was standing on the street, kicked out of the very apartment she'd been secretly funding, accused of being a freeloader. And the irony was so bitter, it made her want to laugh and cry simultaneously. Jennifer had met David Patterson 4 years ago at a medical conference where she'd been presenting her research on affordable healthcare solutions, and he'd been there representing the nonprofit, where he worked as a social worker, and they'd connected immediately over their shared commitment to helping others, their understanding that real success wasn't measured in bank accounts, but in positive impact on people's lives. And when David had introduced her to his mother Margaret 6 months into their relationship, Jennifer had been nervous but hopeful, had wanted desperately to build a good relationship with the elegant, sharp-tongued woman who'd raised the man she loved. Margaret Patterson had been a force of nature before her husband's death, a retired professor of literature, a woman who'd immigrated from Ireland at 25 with nothing but a degree in determination, who'd built a respected career through brilliance and hard work, who'd raised David to value education and service, who'd never accepted help from anyone because she'd learned early that independence was survival and vulnerability was dangerous. And Jennifer had admired her strength even as she'd felt the cool distance Margaret maintained, the subtle ways Margaret made it clear that Jennifer, despite her PhD and her research position and her kindness, wasn't quite good enough for her son. When David's father had died suddenly of a heart attack 2 years into Jennifer and David's marriage, Margaret had crumbled in ways that shocked everyone who knew her. The strong, independent professor had become fragile and lost, unable to live alone in the house full of memories, unable to manage the basic tasks of daily life. And David had been beside himself with worry, caught between wanting to help his grieving mother and not knowing how to penetrate the walls she'd built around her pain. Jennifer had suggested they invite Margaret to move in with them, that they find a larger apartment where Margaret could have her own space but also have family nearby. And David had been grateful, but worried about finances because he worked for a nonprofit, and Jennifer's research position, while prestigious, wasn't highly paid. And a 3-bedroom apartment in a safe neighborhood with good transportation was expensive. That's when Jennifer had made a decision she'd told no one about, not even David. She'd contacted the landlord privately, arranged to pay the full rent each month through an automated system, and told David that she'd found a building that had a special program for families with elderly members, a subsidized rent situation that brought the cost down to something they could manage. And David, overwhelmed with grief and logistics, had believed her and been grateful. For 3 years, Jennifer had been transferring $4,800 every month from her account to the property management company, had been working extra consulting jobs on weekends to cover the cost, had been quietly sacrificing her own financial security and future plans because she loved David, and she'd watched her own grandmother struggle alone after her grandfather died, and she'd sworn she'd never let another elderly person suffer that isolation if she could prevent it. And yes, part of her had hoped that this sacrifice, this quiet care, would eventually soften Margaret's heart toward her, would prove that Jennifer wasn't after David's money, he had none, or trying to take him away from his mother, but was genuinely committed to their family. But Margaret had never softened, had instead seemed to grow more critical of Jennifer over the years, more vocal about Jennifer's supposed flaws. She didn't cook traditional meals like David's father had enjoyed. She worked too much and didn't focus enough on homemaking. She was too independent and didn't defer to David's opinions enough. She was too soft-spoken at family gatherings and didn't make enough effort to impress Margaret's friends. And the criticism had worn on Jennifer like water on stone, slowly eroding her confidence and her hope that they'd ever have a genuine relationship. But she'd endured it because she loved David, and because she'd made a commitment to care for his mother, and because underneath Margaret's harsh exterior, Jennifer sometimes glimpsed the terrified widow who'd lost the love of her life and didn't know how to exist without him. The crisis that led to Jennifer's eviction had started 3 days earlier, when Margaret's sister Helen had come to visit from Boston and had made a comment at dinner about how wonderful it was that David was such a successful provider, able to afford such a lovely apartment for his mother and wife, and Margaret had agreed proudly, talking about how David's non-profit work might not pay as much as corporate jobs, but clearly he was doing well enough to support his family comfortably. And Jennifer had stayed quiet, as she always did during these conversations, not wanting to embarrass David or contradict his mother. And then Helen had asked Jennifer directly what she did for work, and when Jennifer had mentioned her research position and the consulting work she did on weekends, Helen had made an innocent comment. "Oh, so you're contributing to the household expenses too. How modern and wonderful." And Margaret's face had frozen, had gone cold and hard, and she'd said, "Jennifer doesn't contribute financially. She just does her little research projects as a hobby. David handles all the real bills. That's how a proper marriage works." Jennifer had opened her mouth to gently correct this misunderstanding, to explain that she did contribute, that in fact she contributed everything to the rent. But David had quickly changed the subject, shooting Jennifer a pleading look, and later when they were alone, he'd begged her not to tell his mother the truth about the rent. Said it would devastate Margaret to know she'd been accepting help without knowing it, that it would make her feel deceived and diminished. And Jennifer had agreed because she understood pride, and she loved David, and she thought they could just continue as they had been, with Margaret believing what she needed to believe to maintain her dignity. But Margaret had apparently been stewing on Helen's comment for days, had been building a narrative in her mind about Jennifer being a freeloader, a lazy wife who let David carry all the financial burden. And when David had left for a 3-day work conference, Margaret had confronted Jennifer in the kitchen, had launched into a speech about how disappointed she was, how she'd raised David to expect a partner who pulled her own weight, how Jennifer's generation didn't understand real work or real sacrifice. And when Jennifer had tried to explain, had started to say, "Margaret, there's something you don't understand about our finances," Margaret had cut her off and said, "I understand perfectly. You're living in an apartment David pays for, eating food David provides, enjoying a lifestyle David's hard work makes possible, and you contribute nothing but your little academic hobby. Well, I'm done watching my son be taken advantage of. Pack your bags and get out. Maybe living on your own for a while will teach you the value of real work." Jennifer had been so shocked she'd actually complied, had packed a bag in stunned silence, while Margaret stood in the doorway of the bedroom, making comments about how this was for Jennifer's own good, how sometimes people needed to hit rock bottom to grow up, how Jennifer would thank her someday for this tough love, and only when Jennifer was standing outside on the sidewalk did the full reality hit her. She'd just been kicked out of the apartment she'd been paying for by the woman she'd been secretly supporting for 3 years, and the injustice of it, the painful irony of it, the sheer exhausting unfairness of it made her want to scream. Instead, Jennifer pulled out her phone and called David, reached him between conference sessions, and tried to explain what had happened. And David was horrified and angry and said he'd come home immediately. But Jennifer said, "No, finish your conference. I'll stay at my friend Lisa's apartment. We'll sort this out when you get back." And what she didn't say was that part of her was relieved. That 3 years of swallowing criticism and hiding sacrifice and trying to earn the love of a woman who seemed determined not to give it had exhausted her. And maybe this crisis would force everything into the open, would force the truth to come out, would force some kind of resolution, one way or another. Jennifer spent 3 days at her friend Lisa's apartment, and Lisa, who'd watched Jennifer's struggle with Margaret for years, was furious on her behalf and said, "You have to tell her. You have to let David tell her. She needs to know what you've sacrificed. She needs to understand how wrong she's been about you." But Jennifer felt paralyzed by competing emotions: anger at being misjudged and evicted, exhaustion from years of trying to prove herself, fear that the truth would humiliate Margaret beyond repair, love for David, and not wanting to damage his relationship with his mother, and underneath it all, a deep sadness that 3 years of quiet sacrifice had been so completely invisible, so utterly unrecognized. On the 3rd day, Jennifer's phone rang, and it was Margaret, and her voice was strange, tight and strained, and she said, "Jennifer, you need to come back to the apartment right away. Something has happened. David is here, and there's something I need to say to you in person." And Jennifer's heart raced with anxiety about what new crisis had emerged, what new accusation was coming. When Jennifer arrived at the apartment, she found David and Margaret sitting at the kitchen table, and Margaret's face was blotchy and red like she'd been crying for hours, and spread on the table between them were bank statements, rental agreements, payment receipts. 3 years of financial documentation that Jennifer recognized with sinking dread as the evidence of her secret rent payments. David stood when Jennifer entered, his own eyes red, and he said quietly, "The property management company had a system error and sent a receipt to this address instead of your email. Mom opened it thinking it was her rent bill, and she saw your name on the payment history, saw every monthly transfer for the past 3 years. And Jennifer looked at Margaret, who was staring at the papers like they were written in a language she couldn't understand. And Margaret's hands were trembling. "Is this real?" Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Have you been paying the rent this entire time? All of it? $4,800 every month for 3 years? Jennifer nodded, unable to speak. And Margaret made a sound like she'd been punched, a wounded gasp, and she said, "That's over $170,000. Jennifer, that's more than my entire retirement savings. That's more than I've ever had in my bank account at one time. How could you afford this? Why would you do this? Why wouldn't you tell me?" Jennifer finally found her voice and said, her own emotions breaking through, "Because you needed a home and you needed your dignity. Because you were grieving and lost, and the thought of you struggling alone broke my heart. Because I love David, and I love the family we're building, even though you've never made me feel like I'm truly part of it. Because my grandmother died alone in a terrible apartment after my grandfather passed, and I swore I'd never let that happen to someone else if I could prevent it. And yes, Margaret, it was hard. I worked extra jobs. I gave up things I wanted. But I did it gladly, because that's what family does. Even when that family doesn't particularly like you or think you're good enough." The words hung in the air. 3 years of unspoken hurt, finally given voice. and Margaret stared at her with an expression Jennifer had never seen before. Not criticism or disappointment, but absolute devastation, the look of someone confronting a terrible truth about themselves. "You thought I didn't like you," Margaret said slowly, as if testing the words. "You thought I didn't think you were good enough for David, and you still did this. You still sacrificed this much for me." Jennifer felt tears streaming down her face and said, "You've made it pretty clear over the years that I'm not the daughter-in-law you wanted, that I'm too independent, too career-focused, too American, not traditional enough, and I've tried so hard to prove myself, to show you that I'm good for David, that I love him and I love you, even though you don't love me back, and then to be kicked out and called a freeloader when I've been literally keeping a roof over all our heads." She couldn't continue, the emotion too overwhelming, and she turned to leave. But Margaret's voice stopped her, broken and raw. "Wait, please, Jennifer. Please wait." Jennifer turned back to see Margaret standing, her proud posture crumbled, her face wet with tears, and Margaret said, "You're right about all of it. I have been critical and cold and unwelcoming, and I need to tell you why. I need you to understand, even though it doesn't excuse anything." Margaret sat back down heavily and gestured for Jennifer to sit too. And after a moment's hesitation, Jennifer did, with David taking her hand and squeezing its support. "When David introduced us," Margaret began, her Irish accent thicker with emotion, "I saw immediately that you were brilliant and independent and strong, everything I'd tried to be when I came to this country. And I was terrified, absolutely terrified, because you didn't need David the way I'd needed his father. You didn't need this family the way I'd needed the family I built here. And I was so afraid that your independence meant you'd take David away from me, that you'd move across the country for your career, or decide family wasn't important, or realize you didn't need the complications of a man with a difficult mother." She paused, wiping her eyes, and continued, "And after my husband died, when you suggested I move in with you, I told myself you were just being polite, that you secretly resented having to care for your husband's grieving mother, and every kind thing you did I reinterpreted as obligation or pity, and I built walls to protect myself from the inevitable moment when you'd get tired of me and leave. And so I criticized you. I held you at a distance. I told myself I was protecting David from a woman who wasn't truly committed to family, when the truth is, I was protecting myself from caring about you and then losing you the way I'd lost everyone else I'd ever loved." The confession hung in the air, and Jennifer saw Margaret, clearly for perhaps the first time, not as a critical mother-in-law, but as a terrified immigrant who'd lost her anchor, who'd spent a lifetime building walls around her heart, because vulnerability had always led to pain, who'd mistaken independence for abandonment and strength for rejection. "I've been so wrong," Margaret continued, her voice shaking, "so catastrophically wrong. You've been paying my rent, our rent, for 3 years, working extra jobs, sacrificing your own security and future, doing it secretly so I wouldn't feel diminished. And I repaid that extraordinary generosity by kicking you out of your own home and calling you a freeloader. And Jennifer, I don't know how to make that right. I don't know how to apologize for 3 years of being so blind, so cruel, so absolutely wrong about who you are and what you mean to this family." Margaret stood and walked around the table to where Jennifer sat, and then this proud, independent woman, who'd never asked anyone for anything in her life, knelt down beside Jennifer's chair and took her hands and said, "Jennifer, you are not too independent or too career-focused or too anything. You are exactly what David needs, what I need, what this family needs. You are generous and patient and stronger than I could ever be, and I'm asking, begging really, for your forgiveness, for a chance to start over, to build the relationship we should have had from the beginning, the relationship you deserve after everything you've sacrificed." Jennifer looked down at Margaret kneeling beside her chair. This woman who'd made her life so difficult for so long, and she felt the competing emotions warring in her heart: anger and hurt and exhaustion, but also compassion and understanding, and the recognition that Margaret's walls had been built by grief and fear, not malice, and that underneath those walls was a woman capable of profound change, proven by the very fact that she was kneeling and asking for forgiveness instead of defending her actions or making excuses. "Margaret," Jennifer said gently, helping the older woman back to her feet, because seeing her kneel felt wrong. "I forgive you. I've forgiven you all along, even when I was angry, because I understood that you were grieving and scared. But Margaret, I need you to understand something. I can't keep sacrificing myself to prove I'm worthy of acceptance. I can't keep working myself to exhaustion while pretending I don't contribute anything. I can't keep swallowing criticism and hiding hurt because everyone's more comfortable when I'm silent. If we're going to rebuild this relationship, it has to be honest. It has to be mutual. It has to be a real family where we support each other openly and acknowledge each other's contributions and value each other not despite our differences, but because of them." Margaret nodded vigorously, tears still streaming down her face, and said, "Yes, absolutely yes. And Jennifer, I insist on paying you back. I have my pension and my savings, and I can set up a payment plan. I can't accept that you've paid over $170,000 for me to live here without contributing." But Jennifer shook her head and said, "I don't want repayment, Margaret. I want partnership. I want us to figure out together how to move forward. Maybe we find a less expensive place and split the costs equally. Maybe you contribute in other ways, like helping with childcare when David and I have kids someday. Maybe we just start fresh with honest communication about our finances and our feelings and our needs. But I didn't pay that rent to hold it over you or to make you feel indebted. I paid it because it was the right thing to do, and because I believe families take care of each other. And now I need you to take care of me by being honest and kind and accepting me as I am." David, who'd been quietly crying throughout this exchange, pulled both women into a hug and said, "I love you both so much, and I'm sorry I didn't tell Mom the truth sooner. I was trying to protect everyone, but I ended up protecting no one. And from now on, we're going to be honest with each other, even when it's hard, even when the truth is uncomfortable, because that's the only way to build something real." The three of them stood there in the kitchen holding each other. 3 years of secrets and resentment and misunderstanding, beginning to dissolve in the face of truth and vulnerability and the choice to forgive and rebuild. The transformation in their relationship over the following months was remarkable, though not without challenges, because years of patterns don't disappear overnight. But the foundation had shifted from suspicion to trust, from performance to authenticity, from walls to bridges. Margaret insisted they move to a less expensive 2-bedroom apartment, where she could contribute her share of the rent from her pension, saying she needed to feel like she was participating in the household rather than being supported. And Jennifer agreed because she understood that Margaret's contribution wasn't about the money, but about dignity and purpose. Margaret started being honest about her grief and her fears, instead of hiding them behind criticism. And Jennifer found that when Margaret's walls came down, there was a warm, funny, deeply loving woman underneath who'd just been terrified of being vulnerable. And they began having real conversations about Margaret's life in Ireland and her immigration experience, about Jennifer's childhood and her relationship with her own family, about their hopes and fears and the different ways they'd learned to protect themselves from pain. Margaret apologized repeatedly, sometimes too much, until Jennifer had to gently tell her that constant apologies were just another form of penance instead of actual relationship. That what she needed wasn't Margaret's guilt, but Margaret's authentic presence, her real thoughts and feelings, her willingness to show up imperfectly, rather than hide behind either criticism or excessive contrition. They established new traditions: Sunday dinners, where they cooked together and actually talked, instead of Margaret criticizing Jennifer's techniques. Monthly adventure days where they'd visit museums or try new restaurants, or attend cultural events. Honest conversations about finances where everyone knew where money was coming from and where it was going. And slowly, beautifully, they built the relationship Jennifer had hoped for 3 years earlier. The relationship Margaret had been too afraid to allow, until crisis forced the truth into the open. David watched his wife and mother become genuine friends with wonder and gratitude, and he told Jennifer one night, "You know what amazes me most? You had every right to walk away after what Mom did. Every right to say you were done trying, but you chose forgiveness. You chose to see her fear and grief instead of just her actions. You chose to give her a chance to change, and that choice, that grace, it's transformed all our lives." Jennifer smiled and said, "I could have walked away, and part of me wanted to. But Margaret taught me something important, even through her criticism. She taught me that strength isn't about being independent and never needing anyone. It's about being vulnerable enough to build real connections. And the woman who was so afraid to need me, so determined to push me away before I could leave, she needed that connection more than anyone, and once she felt safe enough to drop her walls, she became the mother-in-law I'd always hoped for." A year after the eviction and revelation, Jennifer discovered she was pregnant, and when she told Margaret, the older woman cried with joy and said, "This baby is so lucky to have you as a mother, to have parents who understand that real strength is vulnerability, that real family is chosen every day through forgiveness and honesty and showing up even when it's hard." And Jennifer hugged her and said, "This baby is lucky to have you as a grandmother, someone who modeled that it's never too late to change, to admit when you're wrong, to tear down walls and build bridges instead." When Jennifer went into labor 8 months later, Margaret was in the delivery room alongside David. And when baby Emma was born, Margaret held her granddaughter and whispered, "I promise to love you without walls, to see you clearly without letting my fears cloud my vision, to tell you the truth about your mother, that she's the strongest, most generous person I've ever known." That she taught this stubborn, old woman that love isn't about protecting yourself from pain, but about opening yourself to connection, even when it's scary. That she paid my rent for 3 years, and never asked for recognition or gratitude, because real love doesn't keep score. Jennifer, exhausted and emotional, heard these words and felt something complete, some circle close, because this moment, Margaret holding Emma with tears of joy, speaking truth without walls, expressing love without fear, this was what she'd been quietly working toward for 4 years. This was worth every dollar she'd paid, every criticism she'd endured, every moment she'd chosen forgiveness over resentment, and looking at her little family, she understood that the rent she'd been paying wasn't just for an apartment. It was an investment in belonging, in connection, in the truth that family isn't just what you're born into, but what you build through patience and sacrifice and the stubborn insistence that love can transform even the most fortified hearts. Years later, when people asked Margaret about her daughter, she would smile and say, "Jennifer is the daughter I never knew I needed, the woman who loved my son enough to support his difficult mother, who paid our rent for 3 years without telling anyone because my dignity mattered more to her than recognition, who forgave me when I kicked her out of her own home because she understood my fear better than I understood it myself, who taught me that the walls I'd built to protect myself were actually prisons keeping me from the very love I needed most. And every day I'm grateful that my son found her, that she chose our family, that she refused to give up on me even when I'd given up on the possibility of connection." And Jennifer, hearing these words, would remember standing on that sidewalk with her suitcases. Remember the bitter irony of being evicted from an apartment she'd funded. Remember the choice she'd faced between walking away and staying, to fight for relationship. And she'd know that she'd made the right choice, that some fights are worth having, that some walls are worth dismantling brick by brick, that some people are worth believing in, even when they can't believe in themselves, and that the most powerful thing we can ever do is offer grace to someone who doesn't deserve it, forgiveness to someone who hasn't earned it, love to someone who's pushed us away, because that undeserved grace, that unearned forgiveness, that persistent love, that's what cracks open even the most offended hearts. That's what transforms criticism into compassion, fear into connection, strangers into family. And that transformation, that miracle of walls becoming bridges and suspicion becoming trust, that's worth more than any amount of rent money, worth more than recognition or gratitude, worth everything we have to give, because in the end, love is the only investment that always yields returns, the only currency that multiplies when spent, the only force powerful enough to heal the wounds we all carry and build the families we all deserve.